Well, that was weird. My computer just shut down right in the middle of doing the show. I hope this doesn't keep happening. It's okay. I remember it happening once before, and managed to find my way back. So here we go. I'm reading from and discussing Changing the Immutable, how Orthodox Judaism rewrites its history. This so-called Orthodox history, which insists in viewing the past through the religious needs of the present, is, as we shall see, only the latest manifestation of a lengthy tradition. It is a tradition that long predates our current assumptions about the need for objectivity in telling the story of our past and the importance of absolute truth in our writing. And when I get back into the chat room, I want to take your questions. I'm sorry about completely losing the show there. So Jacob J. Schachter was the first to examine this matter in detail in a lengthy article written in response to the controversy that broke out over my publication of letters from Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who lived 1884 to 1966. Letters from this Orthodox Rabbi Weinberg to Samuel Atlas, who is a Reform rabbi. In his article, J.J. Schachter called attention to a fascinating essay by David Lowenthal, which is very helpful in understanding the phenomenon of Orthodox history. Lowenthal distinguishes between history and heritage, and if we adopted his terminology, we would speak of Orthodox heritage. Heritage should not be confused with history. History seeks to convince by truth and succumbs to falsehood. Heritage exaggerates and omits, candidly invents, and frankly forgets. Heritage uses historical traces and tells historical tales. But these tales and traces are stitched into fables closed to critical scrutiny. Heritage is immune to criticism because it's not erudition, but catechism, not checkable fact, but credulous allegiance. History is not a testable or even plausible version of our past. It is a declaration of faith in the past. Heritage diverges from history, not in being biased, but in its view of bias. Historians aim to reduce bias. Heritage sanctions and strengthens it. So perhaps some perspectives on the Holocaust you could call much more heritage than history, in that treating 6 million as a sacred number, that's not fidelity to historical truth. Now, historical truth might be 6.3 million or 5 million, but the idea that 6 million is some immutable sacred number for Jewish civilians who died in World War II, that's obviously heritage, not historical fact. Also, there are many crazy stories told about Jews being turned into soap or being turned into lampshades. Again, not historical fact, completely contrary to the fact. This is trying to build up a heritage of being persecuted. There have been a number of Holocaust memoirs which were completely invented, or large parts of them were invented. So again, this is trying to develop a heritage, but it's not historical fact. And in World War I, the British propaganda said that German soldiers did all these horrible things as they were marching through Europe, and many of these things were just completely made up. So again, this happened in the first Gulf War when the United States went to kick Saddam Hussein and Iraq out of Kuwait. There are all these stories invented about the cruelties of Iraqi soldiers just committing all sorts of atrocities, which upon examination, many of these stories turned out to be complete falsehoods. So it's very easy when you take a side and you're in conflict with other groups to then make up or be susceptible to believing these non-factual slurs on your opponent. So this isn't just something that happens in Orthodox Judaism. Heritage is not history at all. While it borrows from and enlivens historical study, heritage is not an inquiry into the past, but a celebration of it, not an effort to know what actually happened, but a profession of faith in a past tailored to present-day purposes. So you see this with social justice warriors. They want to continually reinvent the past, say, the United States was never a white nation, when in fact in the first Citizenship Act, in the first United States Congress after the passing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in the 1790 Naturalization Act, it says the United States, immigration to the United States will be limited to white people of good character. So until the about 1960s, Americans across the board thought of America as primarily a white country. And even though there were always some blacks there, they were regarded very much as outsiders and very much as unwanted outsiders. Lowenthal is speaking about the creation of myths in all sorts of communities, and what he says resonates just as powerfully when looking at parts of Jewish society. Joel Finkelman has also recently discussed how the American Haredi community has created a history of Eastern Europe that is both nostalgic and inspirational, but needless to say, it is frequently divorced from the facts. However, as he also remarks, for this community and for others like it, what happened may be less important than what stories we tell one another about what happened. You see this with all insular communities. They tend to, want to make up stories about what happened to increase their in-group solidarity. Many historical stories are invented, they're covered up, all in the effort to create a tangible in-group identity. That is, for teaching members about what it means to be part of the group. And here's a defense of the Haredi perspective. That's the traditional Orthodox perspective by Rabbi Shimon Schwab. He writes, what ethical purpose is served by presenting a realistic historic picture? Nothing but the satisfaction of curiosity. We should tell ourselves and our children the good memories of the good people, their unshakable faith, their staunch defense of tradition, their life of truth, their impeccable honesty, their boundless charity, and their great reverence for Torah and Torah sages. Rather than write the history of our forebears, every generation has to put a veil over the human failings of its elders and glorify all the rest which is great and beautiful. That means we have to do without a real history book. We can do without. We do not need realism. We need inspiration from our forefathers in order to pass it on to posterity. Now, where I come from, I want realism. I want historical truth. I don't want, fables when I want to study history. Same time, I recognize there is a need for inspiration. So I deliberately do not start my day by reading the news or listening to the news. I deliberately wait about 3 hours into my day before I will read the newspapers online. Until then, I'm listening to inspiring 12-step phone meetings or inspiring lectures, inspiring meditations, guided meditations, inspiring music, making outreach calls within my various 12-step programs. So I like to start the day with lots of inspiration, then give me facts. So if we accept the judgment of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Rabbi Schwab's position is actually quite biblical. As Yerushalmi put it, the biblical appeal to remember thus has little to do with curiosity about the past. Israel is told only that it must be a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Nowhere is it suggested that it become a nation of historians. Even a biblical book supposedly dedicated to history, the Book of Chronicles, is actually far from a detached recording of what happened in the past. So you see this in the Bible itself. This was sensed even in the medieval period, and the commentary attributed to Rashi points out a number of times that the Book of Chronicles has as one of its goals the portrayal of King David in a positive fashion. Rabbinic literature is a little different when it comes to recognizing the value of factual history. In the words of M.D. Hur, it appears that the sages understood clearly the superiority and benefits of a fictitious description. In this, they are no different from other great moralistic writers in various times and places. So when you get a moralistic writer or someone who's coming from a position of religious dogmatism, you should not expect historical facts, historical accuracy. In fact, you should not expect anything but the transmission of a certain morality or the inculcation of a certain in-group identity. Traditionalist scholars, including Rabbi Zvi Hirsch and Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin, have also recognized the sages' efforts at whitewashing misdeeds by biblical figures. I think the most pithy way of summing this up is the Talmud and the Midrash in particular practice a hermeneutic of parsimony, personage parsimony. Okay, a hermeneutic of personage parsimony. So they the biblical tales, they want to ascribe everything important that's happened in the past to figures in the Bible. And so they don't want to go outside the Bible. They don't want to have a whole bunch of figures to ascribe the great events of world history. They just want to stick to figures of the Bible. So try laying that on someone. Well, the Talmudic sages believe in a hermeneutic of personage parsimony. I always find that a big crowd pleaser on Tinder. It is with clear ideological motives that ambiguous figures in the Bible are drawn more sharply in the Agadah. The Agadah is the story sections of the Talmud. So in the Bible, you're going to read the story of Jacob and Esau, and you're probably going to have more sympathy for the character of Esau than you are for Jacob. But in the words of the Talmudic sages, like Jacob's clearly the good guy, and Esau is just nothing but evil. And if you read the Bible, King David is a very tragically flawed figure. But in the perspective of the Talmudic sages, King David is the epitome of righteousness, and any of his sins that are written about in the Bible, they weren't really sins because of this and that. So the Bible, I find, a much more sophisticated document than much of the Talmudic commentary on the Bible. This is not merely in the direction of piety, but also to stress the wickedness of those figures such as Esau, who do not appear so evil in the biblical text itself. The modern hagiography is following this path, at least with regard to the focus on piety. So what's a hagiography? It's the biography of a saint. Now, they have their role because I am the beneficiary of a hagiography, not one about me, but about my father. There's a biography of my father, and it portrays his life as the life of a saint. And my father's a complicated man with many good sides and with bad sides, and with strengths and with weaknesses. But this biography of my father, which came out about 8 years ago, just is a biography of a saint. And so that was fun for me to read as a son. You like reading biographies of your father as a saint. But is that really history? Is that really scholarship? It's certainly not disinterested scholarship. So yeah, my father, Desmond Ford. So if you look up biography of Desmond Ford, you'll find the book I'm just referring to. One should not assume that the contrast between realistic history and hagiography is something only discovered in modern times. We have plenty of examples of medieval scholars who are aware of the rabbinic concern with saving the reputation of biblical figures, but still express their preference for the simple reading of scripture. For example, in commenting on Genesis 35:22, which mentions that Reuven slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, Ibn Ezra states, "Our sages explain this beautifully, for a prudent man concealeth shame." So in this comment, Ibn Ezra is alluding to the interpretation of Rabbi Jonathan, cited by Rabbi Samuel ben Nachmani, who rejects the literal meaning of the verse and instead declares that Reuven's only crime was in moving Jacob's bed from Bilhah's tent to Leah. By citing the verse from Proverbs, Ibn Ezra lets the reader know that he understands and sympathizes with this defense of Reuven's honor, even though it is not historically accurate and the shame is quite real. Rabbi Jonathan elsewhere absolves David of the sin of adultery with Bathsheba, claiming that Uriah had issued her a divorce. Despite Rabbi Jonathan's claim, a number of traditional authorities do not accept his approach and regard David as having sinned in this matter. This is, of course, the plain sense of the biblical story, as well as that of Nathan's rebuke. The prophet Nathan, really let the king have it. So the issues discussed also resonate in general discussions of historiography. So Cicero declared that there are two rules obligating a historian. First is that he should not dare advance a falsity, and the second, there is no truth that he shall suppress. Yet these goals were not often met in ancient history. So Plutarch presented his parallel lives in an idealized fashion, with the intention of conveying moral examples to imitate or to avoid. Other ancient historians acted similarly. They shared the view that the point of history is to celebrate the past and to provide examples of behavior for the present. Even Cicero himself, despite his insistence on telling truthful history, believed that the past could be and should be manipulated and embroidered to bring out important moral or exemplary points. So Judaism is not unique in the way that it substitutes the teaching of heritage for the teaching of history. So history as written in the medieval period became even more fanciful, was indeed very similar to Orthodox history. As Ruth Morse has documented, many medieval writers did not think that there was a contradiction between telling the truth of what happened in the past and altering and recreating aspects of the past all at the same time. So the writer is not just a passive recorder of the past, but one who helps create our image of it. To us, why medieval writers claim that what appears to us obviously invented material was true is another reminder of the incommensurability of our cultures. Historical might be thought of as an exemplary narrative based upon events which had occurred at some point in the past, told to move and persuade its audience to imitate the good and eschew the evil. True tale about the past, which included a vast range of what modern readers would regard as invented material and inappropriate if implicit moralizing. In the different conceptual space of the Middle Ages, true might mean in the main or for the most part true, or even it could have happened like this. I noticed this in journalism. So I've been blogging for over 20 years. And I noticed that journalists want to take a similar tone on a story. They kind of agree, Nazis are bad, Jews are victims, blacks are victims, whites are oppressive racists, gays are victims. And it's like the different groups have different Pokemon victimhood points, and all stories are kind of written to conform with that, so that the group with the most victimhood Pokemon points, they're always portrayed as the good guys, and groups with the least Pokemon victimhood points, such as white men and white Christian men, tend to get a lot of negative press by comparison, particularly when there's group conflict. And it's like journalism has become like this priesthood. It's become like this sacred calling. And so journalists feel this obligation to frame stories in a certain way to promote a certain agenda, and they don't want to mess with it. So when I was writing about the pornography industry, I was just coming up with story after story about a new porn star has tested HIV positive, and this was like the last thing that the porn industry press wanted to discuss. And the mainstream press didn't want to touch it because the whole subject was too icky. But woman after woman was coming down HIV positive. And I tracked it down to they'd all had unprotected anal sex with Mark Wallace. And so I said there's a very good idea that there's a very good chance that Mark Wallace is patient zero in this outbreak, which forced Mark Wallace to come in and get a proper HIV test. And then the evidence shows that he is indeed very likely to have been behind this outbreak. So I had to kind of break the pious narrative of both the porn industry press didn't want to really cover this story very much. They were very reluctant because they thought it put the whole industry in jeopardy. And the mainstream media, their only interest in this story was to show that heterosexuals are just as likely to get AIDS as homosexuals, which is ludicrous. But because gays are an oppressed minority with lots of Pokemon victimhood points, the media was heavily invested that AIDS is not a gay disease, but AIDS is overwhelmingly a gay disease in the Western world. And those are the facts that go against the media narrative, which is very similar to the media narratives that I'm discussing in this book on Orthodox Judaism. Okay, got a lively discussion in the chat room on the Holocaust. So I think I mentioned earlier that the number 6 million, that's obviously, to treat 6 million as a sacred number, you're stepping outside of history, okay? And to talk about Jews being turned into soap by the Nazis. Again, you're turning outside of history and you're making up stories to advance an agenda. So from the scholarly consensus, as I understand it, on the Holocaust is somewhere around 5 million to, up to 6 million were killed. But to just take 6 million as a sacred number, obviously that's not historical scholarship. And so the historian Marc Shapiro writes, "What I am attempting to do in this book is to show how common instrumental truth has been, in particular in the last century. My focus is not primarily on works of history, which is where people usually look for this type of information, but rather on all sorts of texts that are lifeblood of traditional Jewish communities. And so the more traditional any community, the more cut off it's likely to be from the mainstream. And so the easier it is to tell tall tales about, how wonderful your in-group is and how it's been repeatedly victimized by very bad out-groups." So these religious texts are the lifeblood of traditional Jewish communities. For these communities, in particular the Haredi community, it is a community of scholars, and the written word is central. Even the masses in the Haredi world are avid consumers of the written word, which is not usually the case in communities where television, sports, or any other countless pursuits are available for non-intellectuals. In fact, it is precisely because the written word is not reserved for the elites that Orthodox writers and publishers worry about how certain texts will affect those who perhaps cannot handle them. I notice there's a lot, among intellectuals, that they're concerned that the public cannot handle truth. Many intellectuals will recognize that there are significant racial differences in IQ, but I think the public cannot handle this truth, that it will then just go commit genocide on low IQ groups, or the public will start treating low IQ groups as just members of a group and not as individuals, and will discriminate against them, or expel them from their country, or blow up their institutions, or drive them out of town. There's this widespread view among high IQ intellectuals that the public can't handle the truth, and there's also this widespread view in religious intellectuals that the public can't handle the truth. So, for instance, I was growing up in Seventh-day Adventist Christianity. My father had 2 PhDs in Christian theology, and he was aware that the Pentateuch was composed of different sources that were edited together, put in final form about 2,500 years ago. But he wouldn't talk about, the different sources in his public talks, because, the average Christian believed that the Bible came from God, and that God had given the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so he didn't want to challenge or discomfort these traditional believers. Okay, Zev, I'm gonna have to kick you. You're just out of control. And from the chat room, we've got Jay Smith saying, what revisionists deny, talking about Holocaust denial. It's not really denial, it's Holocaust revisionism. And what Holocaust revisionists deny is gas chambers and systematic plan for genocide. And the general says the Einsatz group were anti-communist forces, and surprisingly, this involved killing a lot of Jews. Well, most Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia were not communists or even sympathetic to communists. There was a disproportionate number of Jews who were involved in carrying out Stalin's genocides, but the overwhelming majority of Jews, were not communists, not even friendly to communism. When it is only intellectuals who are doing the reading, ideological censorship is not a pressing concern. However, since the masses are now at risk of being exposed to dangerous material, this has created a phenomenon that, as far as I know, is not to be found in other religions. Yeah, this is fascinating. Marc Shapiro, the scholar here, is saying that the way that Orthodox Judaism consistently and continually rewrites its history is unique among the world's religions. And I am not a PhD in comparative religion, but I was raised very much immersed in Christianity, and then I converted to Orthodox Judaism, and I am well read, and I don't know of any evidence to contradict Marc Shapiro here. I just want to repeat this. Since the masses are now at risk of being exposed to dangerous material, this has created a phenomenon that, as far as I know, is not to be found in other religions. I'm referring to pious guardians of the faith, usually self-appointed, who take it upon themselves to alter sacred texts, the texts written by great rabbis of the past and cherished by all traditional Jews. So Mark points out in his book how widespread it is that the writings of these great rabbis of the past are now edited and amended and faked to try to promote the reigning ideology of today in Orthodox Judaism, and not just in Orthodox Judaism, but also in other forms of Judaism. And this is unique among the world religions. So Jews don't have a reputation of being simple, straightforward people. I mean, they have a reputation of being smart, wily, difficult to pin down. And this seems right in consonance with that reputation. Like, what does the word Jew mean to much of the world's population who never met Jews? It's synonymous with dishonest in business. And so there's a certain element of just dishonesty in Orthodox Jewish history telling that kind of fits in with that stereotype. So Thomas says, do you think there is anything authentically Jewish about Jesus's response to Jewish priests? No, not really. Please tell me in the chat room, where do you think Jesus said something new that was true? And when Jesus said things that were true, none of them were new. So I really don't see anything that he contributed. Jay Smith says, Luke, perhaps the uniqueness of Judaism came from its self-awareness. If the Talmud is the discussion, and some say the denial of the Torah, then at least this is self-analysis at the religion level. Perhaps. Degenerate says, not all Jews were communists, but most communists were Jews. That's not even close to being true. Like, most of the communists running the Soviet Union were not Jews. The extent to which Einsatzgruppen targeted Jews as Jews rather than communists who happen to be mainly Jews is debated. Communists were not mainly Jews. Like, name me some reputable historical scholar. That's ludicrous. Now, there were elements of the communist hierarchy at certain specific time periods, narrow time periods, where Jews were dominant, meaning they might have comprised, 40% of a certain level of the officer corps of the NKVD at a very certain narrow historical time period. You could, make a broad generalization, say that the Jews were running, but not the Jews, but the people who were running the Soviet Union when Stalin took power were certainly disproportionately Jews, and there were far fewer when Stalin died. He certainly reduced the influence of Jews. But if you wanted to argue that most communists were Jews, there's just no scholarly basis for that. It's gratuitous overstatement. So how should a community that prides itself on following the great figures of the past and a treasured historical tradition deal with texts and ideas that reflect a Weltanschauung at odds with the current religious climate? See, in Judaism and Orthodox Judaism in many ways functions like the Soviet Union, in that as as each year goes by, there's like more and more strictness in certain religious practices and in certain religious outlooks, and so then the teachings of the past are just wholesale rewritten, edited or falsified to fit with the current worldview. And so when you have a gadol is a great rabbi. He's only a gadol if he fits basically with the worldview of the most serious traditional Jews of his time. If he were to step outside that worldview, even with all his wonderful qualities, with all his wonderful scholarship, but if he was, say, support Zionism, he would no longer be a gadol in Haredi Judaism. Or if he was like to come out of the closet as a homosexual, like he would no longer be a gadol. Or if he just if he didn't hold by the very strictest interpretations of the law as it was currently practiced in his Haredi community, he would no longer be a gadol. Thomas, were the temple priests doing anything in contradiction of authentic Torah tradition? Well, I'm sure that there are corrupt temple priests. I'm sure there are horrible temple priests. This is the thing. We're going to interview E. Michael Jones tomorrow, and in his books and writings and teachings, he says, authentic Judaism was the temple, but that's like an outsider perspective. An outsider sees the temple and sees the priest carrying out the sacrifices and says that's Judaism. But the bulk of the people actually were paying attention to the bricklayer who happened to be a rabbi, or a water carrier who happened to be a rabbi, or a small businessman who happened to be a rabbi and could expound the text of the Torah. So the priests were the Sadducees, and they had much less following with Jews than did the Pharisees, who were the rabbis. And the Pharisees and the rabbis didn't officiate in the temple. They didn't wear the gorgeous robes. They didn't partake in the pomp and circumstance, but they were the ones who shaped, they were the ones who had the loyalty of the people, and they were the ones who shaped how most regular Jews practiced their Judaism. It wasn't the temple that Jewish life revolved around. It would seem that way from an outside perspective, because that's where the pomp and circumstance and the gorgeous robes were. And also, for many hundreds of years, Jews didn't have a temple. They only got a temple for the first time under King Solomon, so about 3,000 years ago. So what did Jews do before then? Obviously, they led Jewish lives without a temple. Then the temple was destroyed in 586 of the Common Era, and yet Jews kept on being Jews and kept leading Jewish lives even without a temple. And then it was rebuilt a few hundred years later. So there was a big gap between 586 before the Common Era, and then the temple, I believe, was rebuilt under King Herod. So about 400 years later, there was no temple for those 400 years, and yet Jews kept leading Jewish lives, kept, holding allegiance to the Torah and listening to the people who would expound on the Torah and interpret the Torah, who became known as teachers, which means rabbis. And so it was the Pharisees who shaped Judaism going forward. So all Jewish denominations today are the descendants of the rabbis, not the descendants of the Essenes or the descendants of the Sadducees. Ahmed, leave it to the Rebbeim, the rabbis. Why speak about such matters with the Goyim? It is vital for a community that the events, actions, texts, and ideals of the past be made to conform to the present ideological moment. Isn't that just like social justice warriors? I mean, isn't that just also like communist regimes and other, unnatural regimes? That everything that happened in the past has to be made to conform to the present ideological moment. This book attempts to document how this phenomenon is played out in Orthodox Judaism, in particular in the branch known as Haredi Orthodoxy. One can, on occasion, find similar manifestations in other Jewish denominations. So the tension between historical truth and maintenance of a communal myth, what Lowenthal has called heritage, is seen in a fascinating letter of Rabbi Jacob Israel Kanievsky, the Stipler. He was a Gadol who lived from 1899 to 1985. And he was one of the most outstanding Haredi sages of the second half of the 20th century. He was approached by someone who wanted to write about the Haskalah movement and its devastating effect on traditional Judaism. So the Haskalah movement was like the Jewish Enlightenment. Degenerate, you can post links, you just have to not use the HTTP. But you're saying the Soviet leaders were more Jewish than you think. No. That wasn't your point. Earlier you were saying that the communists were majority Jewish. Okay, I understand there are an awful lot of Jews in Soviet communism, but at no point was the communists in the Soviet Union majority Jewish. No point, not even close. They were never even, overall numbers, they were never even 10%. Now you can find certain facets of the bureaucracy at certain time periods, were dominantly Jewish, just as in the United States today, Jews are 1.7% of the population, but they have disproportionate influence in certain sectors of the economy and the media. But at no point was Soviet communists, majority Jewish. Okay, were there Judaisms during Jesus' time instead of in the Second Temple period? Yeah, there were Judaisms, but there was one dominant form of Judaism. That was the one that kept going, and that was Pharisaic Judaism. So the Sadducees and the Essenes were forms of Judaism, but they didn't survive the destruction of the temple. So Pharisaic Judaism was the dominant form of Judaism, and these other minor sects didn't last. What was the percentage of Jews in the Communist Party at the leadership and organizational level? Well, again, you can take, say, the Politburo, and it may be like 20%, or you can take, say, NKVD officers at a certain time period, and it may be 50%. Okay, so there were certainly facets of Soviet communism that were disproportionately Jewish, but at no time were a majority of communists in the Soviet Union Jewish. Like at no time in overall numbers of communists in the Soviet Union, were Jews even 10%. And how about the revolutionaries who the key figures in turning turning Russia into the Soviet Union? Jews were disproportionately involved, 25% perhaps. You could argue, you could bring different statistics, and I'm sure one historian might say 25% of the key figures, and another person might say less than 10%, but it's in that neighborhood of somewhere between. And many of them were half Jewish or quarter Jewish. So you count a quarter Jewish as full Jewish. Ahmed, you should make a lecture on Saint Baruch Goldstein and Meir Kahane and how the Mossad conspired against them and assassinated them. Okay, that's absurd. Baruch Goldstein went into a mosque and shot it up and was killed by the Arabs, who he was trying to kill. And to call him a saint is requires a real moral stretch. I mean, the guy went into a mosque, Muslims at prayer, and just started shooting and slaughtering them. Meir Kahane was the founder of the Jewish Defense League, and then an Israeli politician who pushed for the removal of all Arabs from Israel. But he wasn't killed by the Mossad. He was killed by an Arab terrorist. Okay, so back to the book. He was not sure how he should deal with the notorious Saul Berlin, who forged a volume of responsa, or rabbinic responses to questions, and attributed to the medieval rabbi Asher ben Yehiel, known as the Besamim Rosh. This volume contains a number of reformist responsa and was clearly designed to undermine rabbinic Judaism, and yet all these Orthodox rabbis got taken in. So they were taken in by a troll. And the Stipler told him he should not include anything about Berlin and gave 4 reasons. First was honor due to Berlin's forefathers, came from an important rabbinic family, and it would detract from its honor if Berlin's story as a troll and a forger became widely known. Second reason, perhaps Berlin's soul has already received his punishment, was now cleansed. Therefore, bringing this episode now could do more harm to his soul in the world to come. Then here are his next 2 reasons. He says, discussion of this episode would be humiliating to those Orthodox sages who stood by Berlin and were taken in by the forgery. Yeah, I would say it'd be humiliating, and they deserve the humiliation. In other words, since revealing the mistake made by these leading Orthodox rabbis would reflect poorly on their judgment in this matter, the historical record needed to be covered up. Then the Stipler's final reason was some people's faith would be weakened by the knowledge that someone who's regarded as a great Torah scholar had become a heretic. So Saul Berlin became a heretic. And the Stipler said an article could be written about the destructive influence of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, without mentioning the names of the Torah scholars who had been led astray. Can I explain the exegetical techniques Orthodox Jews use in interpreting the Bible and the Talmud? I've read The Chosen, and there's a little about it in there. It's puzzling to me. Okay, there's no easy way to do this. Well, I guess there are relatively simple ways. So there's the plain meaning of the text. That's one standard method of interpretation. There's an allegorical meaning of the text. So the pshat is the plain meaning, the allegorical, and there's the agadic, allegorical meaning of the text, and then there's the mystical meaning of the text. So there are ways of, if other texts use similar language, then these 2 texts are commenting and supplementing each other. So there are basically 13 basic exegetical techniques that traditional Jews use on Jewish text. Were there differences even among the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and not just a uniform set of beliefs? Absolutely. There were different Judaisms. The Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife. The Sadducees did not believe in an oral Torah that came from God. And so the Pharisees believed in an afterlife, and the Pharisees believed that God gave not just a written Torah at Mount Sinai, meaning the Pentateuch, but also an oral Torah, which achieved final form in the Mishnah, year 200 of the Common Era. And then that was then commentated upon by the Gemara, which achieved final form around year 500 of the Common Era, and that is what's known as the Talmud. So the Stipler's last reason is particularly revealing. From his perspective, there is no reason for the masses to know about the whole Saul Berlin episode. They are supposed to believe that the more Torah knowledge one has, the greater one becomes. And that is what the masses are supposed to believe. But from my 25 years in Jewish life, I have found there's not much connection between how much Torah knowledge one has developed and whether one is a decent human being. So you can accumulate a lot of Torah knowledge and still be an angry, vicious, backbiting, deceitful, dishonest, horrible person. And so the idea that like just studying Torah, will make you a good person, in some cases it's true, but in so many cases not. And overall, I would say that there's no connection between observance level and whether you're a decent human being. So many people pray 3 times a day in synagogue and keep strict kosher, keep the Sabbath strictly, they are honest in business, but many who do that are dishonest in business, and there's no actual connection between how rigorously and scrupulously you observe the ritual laws of Judaism and whether or not you're a decent person. Unfortunately, I wish there was. It would damage the masses' faith to read of a great Talmud Hakam, a Torah scholar, who had abandoned traditional Judaism. Most Torah scholars know about Saul Berlin, and all are aware of similar people such as the Talmudic figure Elisha ben Abuya, that is, learned men who abandoned the Jewish tradition. However, among the masses, there are some who cannot handle this information, and it should be kept from them. Isn't that just like the information about the different levels of IQ among different racial groups, or different predispositions towards criminal behavior, or towards creating solid families versus weak family structures? STD rates are very different among different races and peoples, but supposedly the masses cannot handle that type of information. Hardly needs to be said that all historians have historical biases. Gershon Scholem famously spoke of Wissenschaft der Juden, that's the science of Judaism. So the science of Judaism, Wissenschaft, is different from Orthodox Judaism. So the science of Judaism seeks to be objective, just stick to the facts, and being scientific simply means pursuing the truth, in whatever direction that leads you. So Gershom Scholem spoke of the scientific Jewish scholars' portrayal of Jewry, which has no room for Kabbalah, Hasidism, Messianism, and antinomianism, not to mention the study of Jewish criminals and the like, is nothing less than a form of censorship of the Jewish past. So 19th century Jewish historians had, to their minds, justifiable reasons not to dwell on such matters. Because in the 19th century, there was this, particularly in Germany, there was this great war between Jewish scholars trying to say that Judaism was superior to Christianity and that Jews deserved to be equal citizens of the Gentile lands that they dwelled in, and their critics. So the leading Jewish scholars of the late 19th century, particularly in Germany, but throughout Europe, were really, doing a lot of special pleading, in the guise of disinterested scholarship. But they were massaging and presenting a dishonest portrayal of Jews and Jewish history in service of getting Jews equal rights, in service of Jews not being persecuted, in service of Judaism being accorded more respect, and in service of expressing their absolute hatred and contempt for Christianity. So there was this rise of Jewish scholarship, which was very tendentious and dishonest in the late 19th century, like in service of what the Jewish elites regarded as best for the Jewish people. Do I agree with Moldbug that progressivism is a culmination of Christianity, and it might therefore be a dead end for civilization? That makes sense to me. While 19th century historians, Jewish historians, had to their minds justifiable reasons not to dwell on such matters, like these unpleasant matters in Jewish history, or just even to write about Jewish criminals. Today, all responsible historians recognize that this is not the way to approach history. They are careful not to allow their preconceptions to slant the evidence consciously. Obviously, unconscious bias and distortions abound. However, Orthodox history is an entirely different category, and as already noted, resembles the official histories found in the Soviet Union, or those commissioned by other communist governments or dictatorships. What all these histories have in common is that certain conclusions are disqualified from the start. We agree that Jews were definitely overrepresented in Soviet communism. Yes. Question is to what extent? You want elaboration. Okay, so elaboration on Morbach saying that progressivism is a culmination of Christianity and that it might therefore be a dead end for civilization. Well, I would look at, I see progressivism, I see religion and culture and politics as all being downstream from DNA. And so you want me to explicate. So every form of life has a strategy for continuing itself, and every form of life is better or worse adapted for a particular environment. So Northern European civilization was very well suited when your principal concern was dealing with a harsh environment. So Northern Europeans grew up and developed over centuries to form primarily moral communities rather than kinship communities. So in Judaism and in the Far East, community is mainly based on DNA kinship. But because of their unique background, their unique DNA and unique environment, Northern Europeans evolved to value being a good person more than kinship ties. So this was adaptive when you weren't involved in between group competition. This universalist moral outlook is not adaptive when you're engaging in intense between group competition. So progressivism and European Christianity both come from a particular type of DNA. They come from European DNA. Like Christianity comes from Europe. It was dominant in Europe and then went to the rest of the world. But it's, in historical basis, it's a European religion, meaning it comes from a certain DNA. And when you transfer Christianity to Africa, it's an entirely different thing because you're dealing with an entirely different DNA. Let's say like the Torah, and both written and oral, had been given to Nigerians. They would not evolve Judaism as we know it today. So only the particular DNA of the Jews could produce, Judaism as we know it today. So there's DNA here, and then there's religion, there's politics, there's culture. So progressivism and Christianity both, are the results of a certain type of Northern European DNA, which is adaptive to certain environments and maladaptive to the environment we're in today, where in the West, it seems like all the major countries of the West have, become flooded with groups who are not Northern European in their DNA. And so the West is engaged in tremendous group competition, and Northern Europeans are not suited for that. With their moral, universalist moral outlook, they regard it as wrong to treat outsiders differently than you treat insiders. So when you're then competing against groups who can, say, give public voice to your universalist, moral outlook, but privately practice dual morality where they favor their own group at the expense of outsiders, then Northern Europeans who produce progressivism and Protestant Christianity, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So what was at one point adaptive to a certain environment is now maladaptive to the environment we're in today. Okay, great. So I hope I put a little meat on my response there. Thank you for asking me. Orthodox history also differs from its academic counterpart in that there is a conscious recognition that the history being written is part of an ideological agenda designed to instill the proper education and outlook in the reader. Like if you're using history to instill a particular morality and outlook, in your reader, you're not really doing history. Thus, not only censorship, but even outright distortion is permissible. So it's not just distortion, like even outright lying. If you can lie and make people like more observant of Torah or just have a stronger in-group identity, then most in-groups are going to bless that, even though it's very bad history. It's all done in the name of a higher truth, okay? We can all do anything in the name of a higher truth. One of the most common examples of rewriting or distortions we will see is when kosher books, in order for them to remain kosher, need to be improved a bit. I'm not talking about books viewed as heretical. I'm referring to standard books, part of the traditional Jewish library, which now need to be altered to remain acceptable in the current religious climate. The point is to fool people into thinking that what they're reading or seeing is authentic, and to prevent them seeing things that would be problematic in the eyes of the senses. In most cases, the alteration is done in such a way that readers do not even realize anything's been changed in the text, for if they were to know that, it would defeat the whole purpose of the censorship. The act of censorship, which we will see many, and telling a story which one knows to be false, are simply different stops along the same continuum, all of which have the goal of preserving the faith and self-image of a community. So Killer says, as long as they're an empathic left, when empathy is gone, you get a purge form of the empathetic, the boy who cried wolf. Right. Keeping things simple on my end, what Mr. Ford touched upon very briefly is probably something Christian missionaries must learn from day one. And the Degenerate says the thing about in-group versus out-group behavior in Jews versus Christians rings very true. Yeah, social identity theory is just a tremendously powerful tool for understanding the world. The stronger you feel in your in-group identity, say, let's just say white. Okay, let's say every day you read the Daily Stormer and you listen to the right stuff, the Daily Shower, Fashion the Nation, and read American Renaissance, altright.com, and Countercurrents. Now, I read all those sites. You will grow in your in-group white identity, and accompanying that, you will have increasingly hostile attitudes towards non-whites. You never grow in an in-group identity and not also grow in antipathy for out-groups, statistically speaking, like some individuals may. But statistically speaking, that's just how it works. So if a Jew goes from secular to Orthodox, he's also going to go to have more fear and negative attitudes towards non-Jews. If a Christian goes from a secular Christian to a fervent Bible-thumping Christian, he's going to have increasingly negative attitudes towards non-Christians. If a Muslim goes from being a secular Muslim to being a fervent Muslim, he's going to have increasingly negative attitudes towards non-Muslims. And Degenerate says, you realize from the Christian perspective, this looks like fundamentally dishonorable behavior. This is taking advantage of the host's generosity while betraying them. So, Degenerate, that is a very powerful point. So let's say you have a Christian nation like the United States of America, or England, or France, or Scandinavia. And now let's say they allow in tribal groups such as Jews and Muslims. And the leaders of the tribal groups give public voice to obeisance to these, universal moral outlooks. But by and large, the rank and file practice a dual morality, whereby, for example, in Judaism, it's permitted to lend money to the non-Jew at interest, but you shouldn't lend to Jews at interest. Well, there are all sorts of differentiations in Judaism. It's much more demanding on the way that you treat your fellow Jew than the way you treat your non-Jew. So this is dual morality versus the morality that I was raised in as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. There was no idea that it was permissible to cheat outsiders. Now, certainly there were Seventh-day Adventists who cheated outsiders. There were Seventh-day Adventists in Africa who took part in genocides, had leading roles in the Hutus versus Tutsis genocide in Rwanda. But by and large, there was no notion in my Christian upbringing that there was one morality for how you treat your group, and then a much more relaxed morality for how you treat out groups. That I didn't encounter anyone who had that idea. But in all other ways of life, from Jewish to Chinese to Japanese to Korean to Muslim to like Roman Catholics, I think tend to have more of a dual morality thing than do Protestants. You know, pretty much all tribal groups, all other groups, but those of Northern European peoples who tend to be dominantly Protestant, if they're going to be religious, you know, they practice dual morality, which in between group competition gives an advantage to the group that practices dual morality versus the group that practices universalist morality. So it says the more Christian you become, the more empathy you have to outgroups. And I think you may have a point there. So I was talking about general development of social identity, of your in-group identity, and I think Christians may be an exception. Certainly certain types of Christians, like Mennonites. Okay, not many people hate the Mennonites because the Mennonites don't compete for you know the primo positions and of power and authority and prestige and money and women and song for society. They're just very humble people, and they tremendously give back, you know, setting up homeless shelters, and they're just very generous to outsiders. So the stronger you get in your Mennonite identity, it is not accompanied by increasingly negative attitudes towards, you know, non-Mennonites, let alone non-Christians. And this is also true for many other types of Christians. Like, they're kind of unique in that for many Christians, the more Christian they become, the more broad their outlook becomes. Like, their world expands, you know, their love expands. You know, they want to help the homeless, they want to help people with AIDS, they want to help drug addicts, they want to help, you know, suffering Jews and suffering blacks. And so for many types of Christians, stronger Christian identity does not translate into increased negative attitudes towards non-Christians. But there are also a substantial number of Christians, I would say the majority, of whom a stronger Christian identity does translate into increasingly negative attitudes towards non-Christians. And so when I was growing up, it was the dominant attitude that non-Christians were going to hell, that non-Christians were lost, and you felt sorry for them. So Zed says that someone who was a Catholic and then became an evangelical, she found in both traditions that the stronger one's Christian identity, there was no accompanying increase in negative views of outgroups. Sure that's true of individuals, but I would say the majority of both evangelical Christians and Catholics, the stronger they get in their Christian identity, the more fear and negative attitudes they have towards outgroups. Now there is a new trend of Christian nationalism, or perhaps it's not so much a new trend. It goes back to a very old tradition that we're getting onward Christian soldiers again, perhaps. The altering of the past does not occur simply because people are fearful of what will happen. The masses are exposed to certain things. There is also a more activist outlook. We did not need the totalitarian states to teach us that if you control the past, you have a much easier time controlling the present and the future. This alteration of the past is openly acknowledged by some Haredi writers. So there's the Haredi newspaper Yatid Neiman, and it basically advocates the Lithuanian yeshiva worldview. And it publishes a related complaint that is sometimes made is that we leave out information. This is true, but the reason is that in our Torah-based scale of values, the harm or embarrassment that can be caused to someone, perhaps a family member or bystander, rates much higher than the needs of the historical record or journalistic objectivity. Problem with this formulation is that the family member might be embarrassed that his relative attended yeshiva university, which is modern in Orthodox Jewish terms, or thought highly of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was an early Zionist. Thus, the door has been opened to censor and alter history for any subjective reason. The quotation above also refers to potential harm caused to a bystander as a valid reason for censorship. For example, from the Haredi perspective, the bystander might be harmed spiritually by seeing that a certain sage thought highly of Zionism. So again, we have a justification for not revealing the truth. And let me check the chat room here. So Degenerate says, am I hearing you right? Alteration of history is kosher in Judaism? It is in many segments of Orthodox Judaism. And Killer says, don't forget 35,000 Russian tanks were at the German border at the start of World War II, plus Hitler knew Stalin planned an attack. Yeah, Stalin planned to take over Western Europe. And it's probably only because Hitler attacked him first that Western Europe did not fall under Soviet domination. Yeah, Degenerate is stunned that there'd be such a tricky and dishonest, what appears just very dishonest approach to Orthodox Judaism. So the altering of the past does not occur simply because people are fearful of what will happen if the masses are exposed to certain things. There's also a more activist outlook. We did not need the totalitarian states to teach us that if you control the past, you have a much easier time controlling the present. The concern with the honor of rabbinic figures can also explain many examples of censorship, and it is basic to the contemporary Haredi mindset that matters that do not reflect well on rabbinic leaders should be covered up. So when I was writing about sex abuse in Orthodox Judaism, I continually encountered the attitude as articulated by Rabbi Yitzhak Adelstein that, a cover-up is the best thing. We should not, air this dirty laundry in public. We should, just keep quiet and just, resolve things quietly when we uncover that some major rabbi is also, an adulterer or a child molester or just a general sexual predator. And so the mainstream position of the leading Orthodox rabbis was that you should not read blogs. You should not read newspapers that publish stories about corruption in Jewish life and corruption among the rabbis and the cover-up of child molestation and other offenses, because this would reduce the masses' respect for the rabbis. And from an objective perspective, you could say, the rabbis were just trying to look after their own power and their own salaries and their own influence by trying to get the masses not to read blogs, not to read the newspaper, not to read anything critical of, the corruption and misbehavior in their ranks. So Resurrection Jose says, you mentioned, Luke, your father obtained 2 PhDs in Christian theology. What specific areas? So he did a PhD at Michigan State University in the 1950s in Pauline rhetoric. So the PhD was in the rhetoric program. And then he did a second PhD under F.F. Bruce at Manchester University in the early 1970s on New Testament on eschatology. So you can just Google Desmond Ford. It's got a very lengthy Wikipedia entry. The Bergman says this is how the progressive narratives, entered the mainstream pedagogy as a way of controlling the masses. Marc Shapiro writes, what this book hopes to show is how fluid these types of judgments are, and how in one generation a story, a halakhic decision, halakha refers to Jewish law, or a philosophical viewpoint can be regarded as acceptable, while in a later generation that is no longer the case. The great value that Haredi society places on the reputations of rabbinic leaders can be seen in how Haredi leaders reacted to Rabbi Natan Kamenetsky's book, Making of a Gadol. In this book, Kamenetsky attempted to portray great rabbinic figures in a realistic fashion, the Gedolim. He obviously knew that he was moving into dangerous territory with this book. In his introduction, justified his approach of the realistic approach, rather than writing hagiography. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, 19th century German rabbi, the founder of modern Orthodoxy, had earlier defended such an approach when it came to examination of biblical figures. The Torah never hides from us the faults, errors, and weaknesses of our great men. Just by that, it gives a stamp of veracity to what it relates. Were they without passion, without internal struggles? Their virtues would seem to us the outcome of some higher nature, hardly a merit, and certainly no model that we could hope to emulate. From our great teachers of the Torah, we would learn accordingly. It may never be our task to whitewash the spiritual, moral heroes of our past, to appear as apologists for them. They do not require our apologies, nor do such attempts become them. Truth is the seal of Torah, and truthfulness is the principle of all its true and great commentators and teachers. And then Rabbi Yonah Merzbach, a Haredi rabbi of German origin, adopted a similar approach when it came to a great 20th century Torah scholar, Rabbi Elijah Kaplan. Kaplan wrote an essay expressing a very positive attitude towards Herzl and Zionism, concluding, as my faith in God increased, so grew my connection to Zionism. Needless to say, such an essay is bound to be uncomfortable reading for today's Haredi world. So Haredi Jews are not Zionists. They believe that the establishment of a Jewish state should wait until the Messiah arrives. This essay was later included in a collection of Kaplan's writings published by his son. When asked about the essay, Merzbach replied that he had exposed his sentiments when it originally appeared. Nevertheless, he insisted that it be republished, and the Kaplan's sons and students have no permission to conceal this article. He declared, we are not to be censors of the Gedolei Yisrael, of the great rabbis, and their holy words. Yet, despite any such sources that could be cited in support of Kamenetsky's realistic approach to biography, and in opposition to censorship of the life and opinions of great Torah scholars, the response from the Haredi world was fast and furious, resulted in the ban of Kamenetsky's Making of a Gadol. Joel Finkelman wrote, Haredi writers of history claim to know better than the great rabbis of the past how the latter should have behaved. Those great rabbis do not serve as models for the present. Instead, the present and its ideology serve as models for the great rabbis. Haredi historiography becomes a tale of what observant Jews, especially great rabbis, did, but only provided that these actions accord with or could be made to accord with current Haredi doctrine. The historians do not try to understand the Gedolim, they stand over the Gedolim. Haredi ideology of fealty to the great rabbis works across purposes with a sanitized history of these rabbis. There was a 18th, 19th century rabbi, Israel Lipschitz, who records a legend that although people are accustomed to think of Moses as a great, righteous man, in truth, he was born with a horrible human nature. It was only through great effort that he was able to attain a state of holiness. And no one really took any notice of this passage until decades after this rabbi's death. And then, some rabbis were just, furious by the inclusion of this legend. And so in many versions of this rabbi's commentary, this comment was just deleted. And we find a similar concern with rabbinic honor in many other cases as well. How else is one to explain the fact that the complete autobiography of Rabbi Jacob Emden, 18th century rabbi, has not yet appeared, although there have been 3 censored editions. When the complete autobiography does appear, it will be an academic publication, not one designed for the masses. This is because of Rabbi Jacob Emden's brutal honesty about both his own life and feelings, including in sexual matters, as well as his judgments of other rabbinic leaders, making this a very problematic book for many in the Orthodox world. Yeah, so you don't find any equivalent to Augustine's Confessions in rabbinic literature. So I think this is the result of living in a tight tribal community. You're not going to want to wash your dirty linen in public. So the confessional literature, which is such a huge part of Christianity, you don't find this in Judaism by and large. There is no equivalent to Augustine's Confessions in all, rabbinic autobiographies. There are very few rabbinic autobiographies for this reason. So yes, my father had an ongoing relationship with F.F. Bruce for many years after my father got his second PhD from that scholar. Another example of concern over the honor of rabbinic figures leading to censorship, seen in the Katuv Sham of Rabbi Abraham ben David, the Rabbad of the 12th century. This book was directed against Rabbi Zahiria Halevi, who himself had written criticisms of the Talmudic codification of Rabbi Isaac Alfazi. Rabbad's scholarly battle against Rabbi Zacharia was long-standing, and the language used most vituperative. In an earlier work directed against Rabbi Zacharia, Rabbad even felt the need to justify his language, stating that he chose to adopt the Spanish approach, which he claims allowed disputants to appear as enemies on the field of Torah battle, while in truth they love each other. Whether the Rabbad actually can be said to have loved Rabbi Zacharia, or leave for others to decide. However, in the first publication of the Katuv Sham, one finds a very strange passage. And Isidore Tversky had this passage in mind when he noted that the Hasidic manuscript concealed much of the vituperation in code. So it wasn't the manuscript that concealed the vituperation, it was the modern publication, which just took out all of the harsh language of this, the Rabbad, who was a huge 12th century rabbi, but modern people publishing his works, these modern Orthodox Jews, felt that they were entitled to censor the Rabbad because they knew better. So Zed says that the woman was not just intended to be man's helper or his companion, rather she was intended to be a savior, his deliverer. Well, I think she was to be his helpmate in opposition to him. So I think that's what I was told, the literal meaning of the helpmate, in opposition. So she is someone, the wife is someone who's going to both help her husband and continually challenge him. In 1937, Abraham Isaac Rabinowitz published a small book of Hasidic tales. Despite his good intentions, some felt he was not careful enough in what he decided to include. One of the stories describes how some of the sons of Rabbi Shnoya Zalman Frodkin of Lublin did not behave properly. After the wife of his oldest son died, the widow remarried. Under the wedding canopy, Rabbi Shnoya Zalman placed his hands on his son's head and in a weeping voice cried out, "My son, God will help you to become a penitent." And his blessing was fulfilled because he later traveled to the land of Israel. There he became a great Baal Tshuva, someone who became religious and almost a tzaddik, or a truly righteous man. But when this book was reprinted in 1966, this story, which many would find moving, was omitted because it was not thought proper for the masses to know that a great man like Rabbi Shnoya Zalman had children who did not follow in his footsteps, even if at least one of them later mended his ways. So while the instance just mentioned deals with possibly embarrassing family history, find cases where the embarrassment shielded by censorships relates to the rabbinic sages themselves. Disputes between great rabbis have not been uncommon in Jewish history. Yet in the midst of these disputes, accusations have often been made that many in the Orthodox world would now prefer to be forgotten. A good deal of censorship and rewriting of history focuses on this area. Like if you study, the traditional way of studying Torah text, and you read the argument, so you'd have in a commentary, you'd have the biblical text here, and then you'd have all these other commentators, commenting on the biblical text. And these commentators, like, they just hate each other sometimes. Like they just have so much vitriol for another rabbi, often of a different century. But I think Ibn Ezra said of Rashi that he did not have one, rational explanation in 1,000. And the Rambam, Moshe Maimonides, he was very rationalist, while the Ramban, Nachmanides, was a mystic. So they had almost opposite approaches. And it's often said that the most hilarious verse in the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, is the one that says that Torah scholars increase peace in a community. Because if you have much experience of Jewish communal life, the more Torah scholars you have, the more disputation, argument, machloket, controversy. Another example, when some feel censorship is called for, is if a sage egregiously erred in what he wrote. The desire is therefore to cover up this error. So Rabbi Eliezer David Grunwald served as rabbi of the Orthodox community in Satmar in the early part of the 20th century. His response given to Rabbi David Katzberg to prepare for publication. Katzberg was a fine scholar in his own right. Going through Grunwald's writings, he came upon a responsum in which Grunwald took another author to task for pointing out an error in the Torah's chapter divisions. Grunwald saw this was as unacceptable positions, as these chapter divisions go back to Moses at Sinai, and therefore contain all sorts of Torah wisdom. Katzenberg was not sure what to do with this responsum, since to print it would show that the author was ignorant of a pretty basic historical matter, namely that the chapter divisions found in the Pentateuch are of Christian origin. They don't go back to Moses and Mount Sinai. So Katzberg turned to two leading Hungarian scholars, asking them how to proceed. And one of these scholars was also unaware. History of the chapter divisions, expressed agreement with Grunwald's view that the chapter divisions were of Jewish origin. The other scholar said that the responsum should not be published before the matter was thoroughly investigated. So Katzenberg did not need to investigate. He knew the truth. He knew the history, and he wanted to know, was it proper to publish a responsum that makes an obvious error? And so Winkler, the sage, agreed that if Grunwald made this obvious error, that responsum should not be published. So even the big errors that rabbis made, they then get covered up in future generations. And there's no parallel to this constant rewriting of, one sacred text in any other religion, but in Orthodox Judaism. Similar example appeared in a volume of commentary on the Torah by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Diskin. Someone noticed that Diskin, who identified with Jerusalem's most extreme Orthodox community, quotes from the work of the Hakorim. And this was written by a notorious Moskil, meaning a free thinker, Hertz Homburg. By the end of his life, it incurred the nearly universal hatred of his Jewish contemporaries. So once it became known that this Haredi, Diskin, was quoting a free-thinking secularist, the volume was embargoed till the objectionable passage was removed. People responsible for this censorship acted on the assumption that Diskin did not know who Homburg was, thus mistakenly quoted from his work. By removing the reference to him, the censors felt that they were saving Rabbi Diskin from embarrassment. And Zed says, I switched from Catholic to evangelical so that I could join the ministry. Becoming a nun held absolutely no interest for me. Yeah, so the problem is when women join the ministry, men drop out of religion. So unless you hold particular roles just for men, men are going to drop out of the religion. That's just how it is. That's basic sociology. Those who practice this sort of censorship would in no way agree with Shul Stamper's judgment that their actions show that they presume that they are wiser than the author of the text being censored. From their perspective, it's not at all incongruous to be both a loyal student and a loyal censor. This is because a completely innocuous passage in 1900 could be regarded as embarrassing or religiously problematic 100 years later. Many of these censors act on the assumption that the authors themselves, were they alive today, would agree with the censorship. And Yehoshua Monshin describes this type of Hasidic censorship. The phenomenon that Hasidim omit things from the writings of their rabbis is not at all rare. They do not see this in any contradiction to the holiness of the words of the Rebbe, as long as they assert that their intentions and actions are proper and correspond to the true outlook of the Rebbe when the omission is done out of a concern of damaging the rabbi's honor. So Zed says it's so sad that men just drop out of religion where women are ordained. Maybe sad, but it's just human nature. Like unless men are given special roles, they're not gonna participate in a religion. Like men need room to just be with men. It's like men want to just be with men and women want to be with men. So it's not like men are pushing to get into women's sewing circles and like women's only stuff. But as soon as women enter a profession in any numbers, it loses all prestige for men, by and large. Men want to be men, working with other men, and they don't want to have things mucked up by having a bunch of women around. Okay, not many people on the alt-right want to impose white Sharia. That's just like goofy trolling. Most readers, while understanding what motivates the censors, will nevertheless conclude that the instances of censorship that we discuss in this book are great examples of what the Talmud describes as a generation that judges its judges. The notion that information, even from canonical text, should be kept from the masses was, as is well known, an important issue in the medieval and pre-Reformation church, and was responsible for opposition to translation of the Bible into the vernacular. Jews often think this was an exclusively Christian phenomenon, and that Jewish thinkers were always in favor of Torah knowledge for all. Yet this was not the case. Just as the church's concern with vernacular Bibles had to do with the heresy that could come from individuals approaching the sacred text unmediated, so too there were concerns of a similar nature among Jewish scholars. I'm not speaking here about the study of philosophy or Kabbalah that was always viewed as reserved for the elites, but of the Bible itself. With the rise of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, in the late 18th century, and the prominent place it gave to Bible study, one sees a counter-reaction from the Orthodox. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger was even asked whether it was permitted to study the Bible intensively. He answers in the affirmative, but his permission is limited to adults. Children are not to be exposed to such study for fear it will lead them into the web of the heretics. So there are the Orthodox rabbis who are afraid that teaching children too much Bible would lead them into the web of the heretics. And Degenerate says the point of white Sharia is to make women understand how the freedoms they have been given and what they choose to do with it has weakened our society. It's a good point. Yeah, the white Sharia is trolling with a purpose. Great point, Degenerate. Yeah, women definitely need their own space and their own voice. And men need their own space and their own voice. Like the sexes and the races and the different peoples and different religions all have different roles. They're all better suited or less suited for particular environments. The white Sharia horse crap almost became the straw that broke the camel's back last year with me. Simply put, wanted nothing to do with the alt-right. Yeah, I can understand it. But if you stick to Jared Taylor, the thoughtful intellectuals like Greg Johnson and Richard Spencer, I don't think you'll be revolted by this kind of nonsense. The nuclear family has been massively damaged by feminism. The stupidity of feminism hasn't made the alt-right happy. Now, many content creators on the alt-right have the attitude that they never disavow other alt-righters, even neo-Nazis. It's stupid, as one commentator. And Resurrection says, I was kind of fooled by the trolling. However, a number of alt-right guys were quite serious about it, if I'm not mistaken, from what I saw in the comments section. Well, the people who write in the comments section, they're not generally the highest IQ. Like, I'm lucky. Like, this is a high IQ show. People who are writing in this chat room are high IQ, but generally speaking, comment sections are not high IQ. Yeah, it's not useful to try to defend dumb crap like white Sharia. That says, what have men been doing over the past 50 years? In my opinion, they've been effing their friends' daughters, strippers, porno. White man, can you answer to that? Well, the best answer to that is Sexual Utopia and Power, that essay by Roger Devlin. And most men have not been effing their friends' daughters. Like, let's just say, most men are sexually attracted to attractive women, even when they are their friends' daughters. But only, one guy in 50 is even, able to have sex with their friends' daughters. Only a very low percentage of men are able to have sex with strippers. Men do use porn. That just taps into what men want, but they don't get these kind of porny scenarios in their real life. Degenerate points out there's no need to defend white Sharia. It is not serious. The alt-right is not religious. Well, the leading intellectuals of the alt-right, generally speaking, are atheists. But I would say most people who identify with the alt-right are Christians. Yeah, we've got some really smart people in the chat room. I love this. Rabbi Moses Sofer is reported to have expressed the same attitude with regard to the study of Hebrew grammar, whereas in earlier generations its study was completely proper. Once the heretics began focusing on it, the pious were asked to keep away from studying Hebrew grammar unless they become contaminated. Even the basic study of Jewish law by laymen was frowned upon by some. Thus it's reported that Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin refused to give an approbation to the Hayei Adam, a Halakhic handbook by Rabbi Abraham Danzig. He did not believe that the masses should have easy access to texts of Jewish law, and thus no longer be dependent on a rabbi. Likewise, Rabbi Chaim Sofer opposed vernacular translations of the Halakhic code of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried. So there are a lot of similarities between the Roman Catholic Church's desire that the masses not have access to the Bible and the vernacular, and a similar attitude by leading Orthodox rabbis of trying to contain access to basic text by the masses. And part of this is just power. If only you have access to the sacred texts, then you can tell the masses what they contain, how they should behave. If the masses have access to the sacred texts, then they can speak back to you, and your power is being challenged and in all likelihood diminished. And G says, skepticism of women in the right has a lot to do with women's voting behaviors and social justice warrior activism. Yeah, I like that. Resurrection says a rough guesstimate of religiously inclined folks in the alt-right would be 50 to 60%. It could be 75%, probably 65%. Yeah, I would say that they're the majority. In the 18th century, Elchanan Kirshner's Simchat HaNefesh was burned by the rabbis of Vilna. The book's crime was that it discussed Jewish laws and customs in the vernacular. In an early area, Rabbi Jacob Molin of the 14th, 15th century also expressed his opposition to a halakhic, that means works of Jewish law, in the vernacular. These viewpoints, while no longer popular, have not completely disappeared. Thus, one opponent of the ArtScroll translation of the Talmud offered as his reason the notion that Talmud study is supposed to be restricted to the elites, and that ArtScroll frustrates this goal by allowing the masses to participate in the study of Talmud. Daily Stormer and Andrew Anglin are equally interesting and discuss metaphysical concepts once you get past the aesthetic. The way the Stormer hijacks normie media is amazing. Yeah, the Stormer is amazing. He's certainly not for everyone. It's it's trolling. It's horrifying depending on your perspective. I wouldn't recommend making it the meat and potatoes of your media diet, but he has his own brilliance. So Christians are looking for places to stay relevant, but correct. The alt-right movement is not a Christian movement. It's not. The alt-right movement is an atheist movement in that its leading intellectuals are atheists. Yeah, Degenerate says, once you get past the gas the kikes rhetoric on the Daily Stormer, that website's a lot smarter than you would otherwise think. But on the other hand, there is no excuse for praising Andrew Anglin, writes G. His side inspires something like 3 kilos. That's true. I absolutely, agree that that side can unhinge people, leading them in a very dark direction. And the gas the kikes, the genocidal rhetoric, may very well turn away more white people from white advocacy than it brings to white advocacy. So when you're using that kind of genocidal neo-Nazi rhetoric, yeah, it's very edgy, but you also turn off a lot of people, and you also turn a lot of unstable people in a very dark direction, thus bringing tremendous calumny on the whole white advocacy movement. So even though I recognize the brilliance in what the Daily Stormer does and what the Daily Shower does, I also recognize that they come with huge dark sides. I recognize that they can stimulate people to just horrific behavior. And I also recognize that they just turn off normies. It just makes them want to have absolutely nothing to do with white advocacy because they're so offended by the genocide memes, particularly on the Daily Stormer. Look, why you were even praising it. Well, I got to recognize brilliance, and Anglin does have a lot of interesting content, and his humor is actually, quite good at times. But yeah, it's harmful to the white advocacy movement. Great point. Okay, so why am I praising it? Because I do not see my role is praising the white advocacy movement or trying to recruit for the white advocacy movement or praising the alt-right or trying to recruit for the alt-right. I stand outside these movements and I just try to describe what I see. So if someone like Andrew Anglin has both, horrifying, dangerous, genocidal rhetoric that will turn the stomachs of normies and may very well do far more harm to the white advocacy movement than good, I also, for the sake of truth, want to recognize that he can be funny and insightful. So my mission is to try to tell the truth as I see it. My mission is kind of the opposite of the censorship and the distortion that I was mentioning in reading from this book, Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. I just want to call it as I see it. I'm not going to shape my calls to try to promote the alt-right. Yeah, even pagans can be nationalists. Yeah, Zed says, I just couldn't take the Hitler stuff as that lens has nothing to do with my draw to ethno-nationalism. Yeah, the Daily Storm is definitely not for everyone. Degenerate says there's a psychological strategy to it. It's like a bold statement of complete rejection of political correctness. It's like fetch as much as you want. We dare to say it. Absolutely. So I agree here with all perspectives on the Daily Stormer. I agree with the people who say it's destructive to the movement. I agree with the people who say there's brilliance to it and that it's bringing people into the movement. I agree with the people who say it can lead mentally unstable people to commit murder. So I think all these different perspectives are valid. And that's why it's so much fun talking to you guys, because you're smart. And I want to recognize the truth, even when it's inconvenient, when it's painful, when it's offensive, when it's horrifying. Let's just take the manifesto of Dylan Roof. What Dylan Roof did was absolutely horrific. He went into a black church and just shot it up. It was just absolutely horrifying. Oh, just turns my stomach. Absolutely disgusted, horrified by that kind of behavior. Appalled. It's evil. It's bad. Horrible. On the other hand, if you read Dylan Roof's manifesto, which he didn't spend a lot of time writing, he just basically dashed it out. It's a very powerful document. So on the one hand, I recognize just the evil of what Dylan Roof did. And on the other hand, I recognize the power of his manifesto. I recognize the power of the Unabomber's manifesto. And at the same time, I recognize the evil of what he did to innocent people, sending them bombs through the mail. So, geez, sad we have sidetracked Luke from the content of his show. He likes the shows where I'm just able to talk about one topic without going into the alt-right. That's just my shows on the 12 steps. And so I enjoy the banter back and forth. And tomorrow at 9 a.m. West Coast time, we have E. Michael Jones as our guest. So I hope you join us then. But for now, bye-bye.